on an early draft of literary machines, and I did wonder whether that's something that might benefit from the sort of memorialization that you've done, in your eLit library.
Absolutely, and you know what? I'm using it. I'm teaching hypertext course this spring with Klaus Albeck and University of Petros in Greece. Yeah. And so I'm planning to use it, but I would love to do an event during the spring if that's possible.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I'm embarrassed to remember, actually, it's 2017, I made an ebook of lit machines, and broadly it's been good to go since then, but I didn't know where to put it. And the reality is, it'd be nice to make some pin money for TED, but, I think probably as important is not just sort of throwing it into the void so no one uses it, but putting it in a way where people say, no, this is an interesting and seminal text, and here it is in a digital form that you can understand.
Yes, and I do have the copy you gave me. It works perfectly fine in iBooks.
Yeah.
But I would love to see it resurrected, and there's so many different versions of it, right? Editions of it. It'd be nice to reflect it.
Yes, I don't know if even Ted knows. Yeah, and I'm sort of digging into that, but I'll pick up on another forum. But I just leave that part of that thought with you. Sorry,
yes,
Fred.
Patrick, haven't seen you.
Oh, right. So back in a bit.
I pop in and out, but it's been a while.
How's Winona? Do you like it?
That's a long story.
But you're working with one of my favorite people, and that's Davin. He's just fantastic.
Of course. Exactly.
Well, I like Callan too, but Davin and I are particularly close.
I know.
Rhoda's there. Rhoda, you?
He'll be back in a moment. He was running a bit late, so I don't know where he was. It looks like Fabien is here, but off camera at the moment. So people are filtering in.
Well, Mark, at this moment, I'm building chapter 3 of the Scalar book because I wrote that print book for Cambridge, but I have to make a Scalar book to go with it and have video clips of all these hypertext. And I'm working on Afternoon of Story. The whole chapter 3 is on Afternoon of Story.
Yeah.
So
no, it's interesting. So I sort of misread because Klaus said, would I do an interview for SIGWeb? And I thought, yes, well, that's an interview. But in fact, it's one where I have to write all the answers. So I'm thinking, oh, no. But it should be interesting. So is that cup close or just very big? To use Father Ted description.
Oh my.
Hello.
Hello, Fred.
Thank you for your indulgence. I had a meeting that, sorry, my monitor's camera's a bit. Yeah, there was wine involved in the previous meeting, so it ran over by an hour. What is that light thing? That's pretty awful. Anyway, I'm not the one you'll be looking at today. It will be Fabien. So are there any things to be discussed before we let them loose? Actually, okay, before we begin, just a few details. I'm very, very happy that Andrea is here because I've been slaving away on your section of the book like mad. Which is very interesting and worthwhile because you went through with Bob Horn doing headings and stuff. Oh, here's Bob. I will make the comment with him in situ. Hi, Bob. I was just mentioning, Bob, that your editing of Andrea's article has been a real pain in the neck, but for interesting and good reasons. Because you did it in Word or something, and I had to put it in author, so I had to convert the headings, which is just drudgery, not a problem. But in the table of contents, it now takes up a huge section, and many of them have many of the articles have maybe one heading. So this was really useful because I had to decide, are we trying to put together a book of one stylistic presentation? Or are we truly experimenting? And of course, the answer is that we are truly trying to experiment. So it's really, really good that we have such different kinds of articles, not just in length, but also in presentation. Barbara Tversky's article has had an equal amount of going back between her and me and a lot of pain and headaches, but also it's a very different result and it's very worthwhile. So I wanted to say thank you for that, both of you.
Thank you for mentioning it. And I'm glad, as you know, I'm an advocate of tables of contents that tell you what's in the book.
Yeah, indeed.
What the ideas are, not the people, what the ideas are.
Yes.
So, okay, great, terrific.
That's very good. And any other things or business or observation? Oh no, there is one more thing before Fabien from my side. If anyone else, please say. I sent an email, hopefully to all of you. It was a bit random, so if you didn't get it, I apologize. Saying, here are my observation of having used VR over the last year, VR, AR. I took a few things and put it in our Twitter chat and I realized this should be in the book. And I invite all of you to do the same. If you've been using a headset, is there anything surprising, good or bad, and do you have any wishes? This is not a request for an article. It could be one sentence or a paragraph or whatever you like, but it would be nice to have it now so that over the next year, as our perspectives will change, we have that to look back on. Purely optional. If you have it, please get it to me by Monday. Please, Andrea. Andrea, were you talking? I can't hear you, even though you're not muted.
Sorry, yes.
Now I can hear you, yes.
Now I'm okay, yeah. All right, I have something quick to say about my part of the book. So first, thank you so much for doing all this work. And can I help with editing that section? As in, I've just skimmed through it. I've not actually read everything. I know it's a transcript, so I'm assuming in some parts it's probably a bit jarring since talking is not the same as writing. Do you feel like the quality of that is too poor in some cases? Because if yes, I'll be happy to rewrite parts of it so that it doesn't sound like it's someone speaking, so it becomes more, or is that part of the experimental?
Mark, my co-editor here should feel free to interrupt, but because of your piece, the introduction of the book, underneath the logo on one of the first pages, it says, this book is the result of the Future of Text Symposium. It's the third book in a series. And then I say, this book is an experiment and experience, just like all our work. So I think that answers your question. I really think we need to have fun with text. The future of text should not be one single thing. I think that a transcript, that as long as you remove words like so, we all say so a million times, it turns out, as long as that stuff is gone, and as long as the, oh, sorry, I'm having connection problems, that bit is gone. You know, it's there in the video, we don't need it. But beyond that, to make it grammatically interesting, I personally see no need for it.
I'd chip in as someone who's pored over the transcripts in the past that no, I'd agree. And generally the presentations don't suffer from being in the moment. Sometimes there's a bit of sort of chiseling out of, you know, run-on sentences or missed parts in the discussion, but then that's a discussion. And actually, the more you try and turn it into finely honed sort of written prose, I think it becomes a bit subjective, and it just actually you begin to wonder, well, why bother? I mean, I think the thing is to take it as it is. It's clearly stated, it's discussion, it's transcript, and I found very little need to do sort of editing in the transcripts, other than where the software has basically made a complete misguess of what was being said.
The interesting things on this topic is also in Jaron's keynote, I did the same kind of rough editing, mostly bolding because it takes less space than a heading, which of course is an interesting discussion in itself. But also I did a few bullet points, which of course wasn't spoken. One thing that he may or may not want to take out, and he hasn't responded yet, obviously he's very busy. I asked him in the beginning of the presentation, he said he's going to talk about 3 things. He only talked about 1 in the end. So that would be an example where he could choose, no, make it self-contained, do more or whatever. But it is a really worthwhile and interesting discussion, isn't it? You know, what is a transcript? Like the transcript of this conversation today, most of it will be useless. Some of it won't be, some of it will be useful. And we over the last year, we've been discussing this again and again and again, and we'll probably keep discussing it because maybe something interesting will fall out.
I want to add, I found looking at that text, that transcript of my presentation in the two formats, so the one with the highlighted things and the one Bob did with the titles, extremely interesting, even for me. I do think they're both useful, but it's a fundamentally different experience of the text. And yeah, I thought that was great. I've never seen a text of mine done in two different ways. But this and this second version with the titles, I found myself actually reading the text 2 times in 2 ways. So you could either read the whole thing or you can just go and read the titles. And it actually became the place I go to when I have to remind myself, what is the bee and the flower thing? So I had a talk 2 days ago, and I was like, oh, I need to put a bee and the flower. Where is a summary of what I'm saying all the time about the bee and the flower? And I actually went to what Bob did. I went to I went to the transcript where Bob put the titles, and I was like, here are the 2 paragraphs about the bees and the flowers. So it already became a tool, even for me, who gave the presentation, about the snippets that I can refer to later. So I thought that was interesting.
That is very interesting. And Dave Millard, who was both Mark and my colleague / our advisor at Southampton, he said that he finds what he needs to cite, not in a library or reference manual, but in his own previous papers. Mm. So also, Mark has talked a lot about writing for, we don't know how it's going to be read. So this is an example of that. And I think that what Bob did is clearly superior to bolding in terms of what you're talking about. I think the only place where bolding wins out is to save space, but the breathing space that we need, and of course in digital document, that's not a problem, which is of course the key thing. But bolding and italic has 2 different functions. Italic is to highlight in a sentence. Bold is to highlight on a page. So headings have yet another navigational benefit. And where I disagree with my esteemed colleague Mark has been just when he uses the horrible thing of unadorned text or plain text. If you remove the spacing between the paragraphs and the headings, you have a different communication. I know you agree, Mark. I'm just being...
no, it's important, because I think that's a mispresentation. It's important to understand that what I'm talking about there isn't for human reading, it's for machine reading. We've got enough problem with AI not being able to understand our reading without making it harder by putting in structure it has to struggle to remove. That's the point I'm making.
Yeah, no, exactly. Bob, you had your hand up.
Yes. As long as there are changes to be made in the book, I would like to request that, and it may be very difficult because I know you're doing it with some sort of machine function, but the key subheads in my book, in my article rather, the last time I read it, I don't know what's today, but 3 weeks or 4 weeks ago when I read it, the key headings had been that are centered have been reduced. The bolding has been removed, and the typeface is less than the bolding of the subheads in the paragraph, so that the major structure of the article is hard to find. I found it hard myself to find it. And then I discovered that somehow all of these centered subheadings were light and hard to find, which was not my intent, which is not what I sent to you. I sent them as bold and larger.
Yeah, but the thing is, Bob, I don't care about your bold and larger or about coloring, in the sense that for this work, we assign headings level 1 through 6. So all the headings at that level will look the same. So the names of the contributors is level 1. the name of your article is level 2, and then what you guys have assigned is level 3, sometimes level 4. So for the really small ones, we sometimes bold them, but in general, we keep it to the same level, which is easier to see on the table of contents rather than inside. But I'd be happy to talk to you in another session about which particular things you want to draw more attention to, and I'm sure we can find ways of doing that.
Okay, thank you.
And Adam, you are here, wonderful. You're the second Swede I've seen today. My previous meeting was with a Swede, so that's very amusing. And off we go. Fabien, are you ready for us? Just to note that this is one of our kind of monthly talks. It is recorded. We will do the transcription of this, and you're all happy to be up on YouTube afterwards. And off we go. Fabien, the floor and screen is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me all right? Can you see me all right?
Yep.
Okay, then I'll share my screen and I'll ask the same question again. So please let me know when you can see my screen. Can you see a library?
Yes.
Yes, super. Thank you. So does anybody know where this is?
The French National Library, I think.
It's in Paris. It's the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, the old site, mostly for history and social sciences. I spent a bit of time there for the history of pedagogy, basically researching a bit on the topic. That's the new one. That's the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, François Mitterrand. All those, there are 4 towers like this, filled with books. And that's at the tip of the iceberg. Everything under, all the staircases are actually the reserve with all the books that go up and down with like little elevators. And that's the map of it, with going downstairs. And each of the tower has a specific topic: numbers, law, time, literature, and then a bit more. So those 3 things are what most people expect as a library, and it still is. But I'm going to argue at first that we're all librarians. It was interesting to see also the webcams. We started to chat earlier that all of us have a little bookshelf in the back, or a bigger one. And I think, of course, we're not, most of us are not professional librarians, but we're still struggling with it, struggling with reading the books, organizing them, and seeing what's missing on our shelves. So even though we're not professional librarians usually, I'm still going to invite you there for that short presentation to imagine that you would be a librarian, and I'm going to argue that you actually are. I have a bunch of notes, so I'm going to stop sharing just for a bit. If I can, yes. So yes, I think like most of you, I have paper notes, I have Post-it notes, I have ink in multiple forms, I have posters, some of them still on the back of my wall, some not, some like folded like this in the tube. So basically, in addition to all those books I have behind, so the ones there for that presentation that I'll share after, I'm swimming in books and notes, either about the books or about the books I might want to write or read. So that's, again, let's say, I would argue the work of a non-professional librarian. And that's exciting, but create a bit of stress and tension. So of course I thought, what if I had a warehouse? What if instead of this tiny room, I had a huge library? What if I could put all those books and notes in, the biggest space I could find? And I do think it would solve quite a few problems, but I don't think it would solve all of them. So I'm going to share back my screen. So one of the solution, of course, like the e-ink I was showing before, is if you have anything online or at least digital, you have you have unlimited space basically. So that feels like a potential solution. Have a bunch of notes on the different books I've read, and then links from one book to the next. It's helpful, but at the same time, as some of you know, when I started to discuss with you, that I find liberating and frustrating. It's liberating because, as I said, unlimited space, and I can organize them like that. But also, as you can see on the left in 2D, I can have the different links from one book to another. And I can also organize them in 2D like that. So those are not, there are other notes, not books, but I have another one where I can just move them in space, in a 2D space. So I think that does open up quite a bit of possibility, but you can see the edge of my screen, and that is pretty frustrating. So at some point, one has to reconsider, like, yes, how can we organize that space? And I think, again, as a non-professional librarian, we can, of course, learn from this. So one of the things I usually find quite exciting when I go to a library is not the book I looked for, but the book that I did not look for. So if I'll take an example, I go on the shelf, I looked for this specific book, and right next to it, I find something seemingly unrelated, or at least I never thought of. And I'm going to maybe enjoy it or find it even more useful than the original one, the one I looked for. And I would argue that this is due to how the library, the physical library, is being organized, and thus the classification system. So you have lots of different classification systems based on the type of library, like the Dewey classification systems, but there are countless other ones. So my argument mostly is that those classification systems are basically how most of the library is being organized, but it's relatively static. So I started to draw it, like what would my virtual library look like if I could take the different books I've read or the notes about the book I've read and I could organize them, what it would look like. And that's become the tricky part, let's say, is that then that starts to be in space. If I go back to the physical library, I start to, again, need to organize it. And I have unlimited virtual space, but I still need to be able to go back to it. So if I change it all the time, meaning to use the analogy in the title of the presentation, if I move the walls of my library constantly, then I might get lost every single time. So yeah, if you have any questions on point, feel free to ask during the presentation. Otherwise, I'll just go on. One of the solutions I find for this was to do it live, because I don't know in advance how I want to organize. I can keep different layouts. So you can see on the bottom right a little squiggly line, which is how a layout of the library, or where I would organize my content here, podcast, would look like. So I sketched them with my could be on a remote, on a e-ink device, could be in VR with a controller, with the hands, and then I'm going to just extrude it. So I do it on the floor, I scale it to whatever size I want, and I'm going to bring it up so that I can start to have walls and I can put content on it. I tried also, like so, to take the documents from a physical device, even though digital, and then put them just as a layout. So that's the question then, is what layout should one basically express, either in VR or otherwise? And I don't have an answer to this. I don't know if anybody has an answer to it. Obviously, if you have one, I'd love to know. But it means my suggestion or my argument for it is that the environment itself, the tool you present to organize your content, should let the actual user, all of us as non-professional or professional librarians, organize that space live. The thing is, of course, if we do it one by one, either by the controller, we take the either the physical book or the 3D model of it, and we move it from one place to another, I'm going to argue that that doesn't work unless you have like 5 or 10 books, or you're infinitely patient, which I'm not. So at some point, I think the beauty of physically grabbing an object, either outside of VR or in VR, has its limits. So one has to go with this, which is programming. It doesn't have to look like this. Programming can be with blocks, so can be with other mechanisms. Can also be a lot of it done for you. So for example, if you click on a button there, you're basically using software. Behind there is code. You're not programming, but using the result of program and a programming language. So yeah, I think my argument here, or the proposal, is that keeping both the natural interaction of being able to grab an object, but also having the power of scalability through code. In the end, I think if we take also those little robots, when they organize a warehouse from here, a certain brand, that's what they do in the end. It's like when you just don't have the resources or the patience, which is also a resource, not to want to do everything by hand, you delegate to the machine. They can be physical like this, but again, I don't have the warehouse I mentioned initially. I don't have this kind of robots, and I don't think I want that actually. But through programming and interactions, I think that's what can be reached. Here, specifically, that's a 3D software called Blender. It's mostly used to, well, actually it's used for everything at the moment. But it's used to basically design 3D models like the one I showed before, like this. You can draw them and then extrude them. You have a couple of functions. And some of those functions I find particularly interesting or powerful precisely because they are the basics for programming, like an array. So you take a model, let's say of a book or of the library, of the bookshelf rather, that the book would be on, and then you can multiply it. Instead of having it once, you have 5 times, 10 times. And if you did twice, instead of having a line, you have an array, you have your box or your rectangle of, again, either shelf or books. So that's, for some of you familiar with architecture, that's also what parametric architecture is mostly about, meaning that you give parameters. You say, okay, I want a bookshelf of 10 books, or I want 10 bookshelves of 10 books. And those parameters you can play with. And I think finally, that's where it's the most interesting. When you have the direct manipulation, so with your VR controller or with your hands, and you can play with those parameters. So you can say, I want 10 by 10, I want whatever, but instead of typing it with a keyboard, like so, you're just going to take your hand or controller and let's say go up or down with a slider, or you're just going to do any kind of gesture in space. And that's going to change the space around you and thus how you organize your documents. And I have a little example for this, if everything works well. So that's a little exploratory environment. I've shown the group a couple of times. I'm going to try to show you in VR how I interact with it. But still, already to clarify, it looks like this. It could look like a proper library, let's say, or the stereotype of a library. It could look like anything. The background is not the most important aspect. What is, though, is one of the document there on the left, which is actually what that presentation is about, which I can share after with the text on it, the instruction there, and also the code.
I'm not seeing anything different, Fabien.
Different from what?
From the woman, the picture of the woman with a microphone and camera in front of her. Are you trying to show us something else than that?
Yes, yes.
It says More Than Meetings. The title is More Than Meetings.
Yes, I'm not showing that at all, actually.
I mean, I'm seeing the I was seeing the I was seeing the environment and that sort of thing.
Okay. So do you see, for example, nenufars and like a blue sky and a green tree on top?
Yes.
Yes.
No.
Okay. Bob, maybe you have another window on top?
Okay. Yes, it was
Okay.
The other window was covering it up.
No worries. So yeah, that's an environment I showed to the group a couple of times. So the environment itself is not that interesting. It's for the exploratory scaffolding, which is why that's my excuse, let's say, to say it looks rough. So there are a couple of instruction text you can move around, manipulate, and some of that text with the GXR prefix is actually code you can execute. And if you have a keyboard, like I'm showing on the webcam, Bluetooth keyboard, you can also type or modify some of that text or code. It's there, let's say, as the starting point. So let me try to show you, if I can, from the headset, which is taking a nap for now. Allow it. For now, you should see still a gray screen. And now you should see from the headset perspective. Can you confirm that you see from the headset?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so that's the demo moment, which is usually when it doesn't work anymore. But let's try. And of course, I'm on the wrong side. So I'll try to adjust it. Okay, yeah, I'm back in there. The grid you see there is when I get too close, and then I see safely through the environment. What's interesting compared to before, so again, I can see my hands and I can grab the text, move it around. I can interact with my wrist to hide and show things. The novelty would be this, that I can grab that text, execute it. So I move with my right hand, execute with my left hand. And I can see this number here that gets updated every time I pinch. So it's a bit hard to read, but I can see it changing, let's say, from a small value when I pinch twice. So between, let's say, those 2 points and a large value, if I pinch there, so you can see 0.9 or something. Why do I show this? Is because what I can then do is use that code there. And that's what happens. So this document can be any document, of course.
Fabien?
Yeah.
To me, the frame rate through the sharing is really, really, really low. The rest of you guys, it's really low, right? I mean, that's not...
About 2 frames a second.
Okay. So I would just suggest, Fabien, that don't move your head about so much, because obviously sharing VR is bad at the best of times.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll do it again slowly, and we'll see if it's better. I'll try not moving my hands, both heads and hands. It's going to be tricky, but I'll do my best. So you see my hands.
Yes.
I can pinch there, and it's going to store this little value on the top left. If I pinch at one point to another, that value changed to say the distance between those 2 points was this much. And I can take a document like the notes about that presentation, move it around. And what's interesting to highlight the point there is if I use this command here and pitch it, it's going to take the last grabbed document, the value here, and it's going to reproduce it n times. So here that would be, let's say, 16 times. If I had another document, it would apply to that document. And if I type on my little keyboard here, voila, you can see the code there. Oh, I mean, some text appearing there. My point being that this idea of being able to take a document, a series of documents, or a shelf, so that you can organize that space, both at a very large scale, because it's programmatic, and yet tangible, because tangible, directly manipulable, is where it becomes interesting to manipulate documents and the way you organize them in space. That intersection, I'm going to remove the headset to avoid frame rate issue and more. Yes, so that's I believe it's the point where it gets interesting, when you can have, through programming, parametric architecture or design, the ability to manipulate a large corpus of document, and yet preserving that ability to manipulate directly. So you could imagine, of course, that, for example, through that beautiful drawing, I could, instead of saying, oh, I want to take 10 books or 100 books, and I pinch twice, that I would take an arrow with my hands and it would multiply the result. It's not visibly direct there, but you can imagine, say, selecting a document, you see another color, or the arrow visible, and then you see it spread over an area rather than just a line. And voila, that was it.
Before I say thank you, actually, after I say thank you, and thank you, I thought you hated books, Fabien. You have an article in the Future of Text saying, I hate books. So yes. Is this work you showed us today only referring to legacy books, or is this because you're envisioning books also being something different?
I think that you put it the right way, legacy books. I think this is horrible. I love those books, but I think every book should have with them some code, so that you can have some implementation of the idea of the books that you can play with and challenge the content of that book. I'm saying this, of course, yeah, like you said, legacy. Funnily enough, I was reading an article last week about learning nanophysics in VR. And the outcome of that research was that bringing legacy content, so here it was in VR, learning nanophysics. So you're with your headset, you play with extremely dangerous and expensive machine. And what you have next to you actually is not the book, but it's a fake iPad or virtual iPad, so that you would have a notebook or actually instructions in a traditional way, let's say, from the old medium to the new medium. So I don't want to throw my books. I actually cherish them, but they're all, no matter how good, terribly outdated. I think as a pedagogical medium, if your point is to learn and challenge the content, books are horrible.
Okay, well, we're waiting for other comments. I have to ask the question we've discussed a lot, and that is our Future of Text Volume 3, which will have one incarnation in a plain, boring PDF. In what manner, Fabien, do you currently see going into VR? Obviously, for the rest of you, the book will be available as HTML, RTF, JSON, and obviously PDF. So what should we do, Fabien, to really support your vision?
So I'm going to, you can imagine a library as a corpus of books. You can imagine the book for the Future of Text as a corpus of chapters. So in the end, what I'm going to do is explore how to organize those subunits or chapters, let's say, in space, and through this like parametric design of the space with direct interaction in VR and programming, so that, because I don't, how many chapters do we have right now? Roughly. We can't hear you.
Exactly too many.
Wow, so that's a perfect example of when it becomes, in my opinion, interesting to have both direct and scalable through programming way to organize the space. So too many is the answer I was hoping for.
Yeah, it's a little over 250,000 words.
Fuck.
So the whole point of the book that it is too long, and I actually, hang on, let me just check something here. 1 second, I'm so sorry. Right, okay, I'm going to share my screen really quickly to address your question of the size of the book. So if we go, we have our not very nice cover page, and then here is the table of contents. And you can see, Andreas, we talked about earlier, it's a ton of subheadings, and then, you know, some really short. I'm also somebody who has a lot of subheadings, as do you, Fabien. We have level 2 because we've written several articles.
Can I put my headings back in then?
Yes, Mark, of course you need to do that. And you've been one of the experimental subjects for this, but this is the thing that I wanted to show on the size matters issue. So I'm now going through, I get to Andrea's article, which is absolutely massive because it's two things. It's her piece for the symposium, but also her 2-hour presentation, just like today with Fabien. So if I go through it page by page, and especially with the layout that Bob introduced by having a lot of subheadings, it takes a lot of pages. So when you are interested in this article, that's only good, right? But if you want to skip through it, what we've done is this. In our reader software using Visual Meta, if you use right and left arrows, you go by pages. But if you do down arrow, you go to the next level 1 heading. So it's a super simple, not sophisticated thing, but the point is you can really quickly, like I skipped everything that Barbara's written here, and it's a lot of pages. Boom, with 1 arrow. Right.
Magnificent.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to say that in parallel to what Fabien was talking about, really amazing spaces, basic navigation interactions, they're actually really hard to think of, and sometimes they end up being actually quite simple. So I'm looking forward to the complexity that Fabien is introducing to see what kind of simple navigations will hopefully come out of them. I am so sure Andrea's got at least 3 different thoughts going on right now.
Yes, how much time do I have to talk? I'm joking. So first question for Fabien. I want to make sure that I understand the proposition clearly. So is what you showed us the ability for people in VR to run certain methods, pieces of code themselves? Is that something that is an alternative to the typical way of doing software, which is you embed that behind nice icons that you push buttons?
Yes, you can still actually, Adam had a related question in the chat. It's like, do you want a no-code library and just interaction? The point, in my opinion, is not hiding the scaffolding. The scaffolding should remain visible so that people who want to and can modify it. So that the code itself is not so interesting, but the ability to modify it right there and then and position it wherever it helps you to think better about it, I think is, it's unique, let's say. And is it better than traditional, let's say, way? Not necessarily. Is it novel and hopefully leading to other way to explore how the content itself you manipulate? I believe it is.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, yeah, there's just so much to say. I will only make one more comment. You said a few times the background or the environment, as if that's something separate from what you're doing. So you have these objects and the text and the images and the piece of code, which are the things you care about. And then there's the other thing in the back that someone needs to make pretty. I think that undermines what VR is for me as an architect about, which is space. So all of those steps and objects have to become architectural elements somehow.
Yes,
so
yes.
What you interact with and manipulate are either objects in space that rearrange themselves in space, or spaces themselves. And we can talk for a long time about what does it mean to have just space without an object or a building to define it.
No, so absolutely. The thing is, I'm just not far enough. But of course, the point is that the background should not be just the background. The background should be the shelf of the library or the end or whatever you want that you modify by the code itself. There should be no background. The background here is just because I'm not as far as I want to be. So I have to be a little bit vulgar or provocative. But there should be absolutely no background. There is no reason for it. It's just it takes a bit of time, but in the end, if the goal is that there is no background because you generate it through the intertwined interactions and code, that how you manipulate the code, how you move, so that let's say variables or parameter in the code are what's going to shape everything around you, including how you position that space. So background is not correct. You're right about this.
Yeah, I would add that if you were to prototype with this idea of spaces in mind, that will open up a different design space, because your relationship as a user to big objects or to space is different than your relationship as a user to pieces of text. So the moment, like the kind of operations and the kind of interactions that you could do with spaces and objects are actually different. So it will change, it will fundamentally change actually your decision-making process and the outcome of those decisions when you change from text or 2D images to actually manipulating or moving through space.
So to clarify the last commit, the last moment I changed the repository to show you something today was 3 minutes before the presentation. So I'm really not pushing aside what you're saying. I'm just saying that, yes, this is what I want. I just didn't have both the time to think it through and the time to implement it. But that's what I'm doing it. That's what I'm doing.
So, okay, this is such a huge and important issue. Briefly going back to the earlier thing, you talked about kind of text in the environment that can do something. Vint Cerf likes to use the term computational text. I would love to be able to write in an article, something like I just put in chat here, something like, for example, like what everyone else in this book says who went to Southampton, and have that understood by the book, and then in brackets say, Mark Anderson says so-and-so, right? It's a trivial example, but it's the idea that you shouldn't just have AI do it later. As an author, you should have a little bit of control. And of course, as a reader, you should have a little control. So that's a hugely fascinating area. But when it comes to the point of background, first of all, there's a British comedy called Goodness Gracious Me that has an amazing episode of background. We'll talk about that over lots of alcohol at the Groucho Club. However, sometimes you do want a neutral background. Over the last few days, doing a bit of writing in author in VR, it depends. If you're doing research and looking, fine, yes, ideally the whole space, you immerse yourself, you literally go to the library. But sometimes you want to focus on a knowledge object or creation or otherwise. You want a neutral background. So I'm not at all arguing against what you guys are saying. I'm just saying that maybe for different types of modes and work in time and feelings, you should have the choice whether to immerse yourself in the knowledge, which can be heavy and fantastic, or sometimes a lighter touch, or sometimes even a more neutral background, just so that your head can focus on the task at hand and not be distracted. Does that sound against what you're saying, or does that kind of fit?
No, but to jump on that is yes, also of course, because you can as long as you have the control of that background. Like if you want your background to be as neutral as you want, that's still the same point. Like you shape it the way you want. That's the important aspect, that it's optimizing agency. How can you have it the way you want? That's the goal behind it. So if the goal is to be neutral because you want, let's say, to start from a quote unquote blank page or blank space, if that's the psychological space you want to be in to do the task you have at hand, that should be the book. Yeah, that should be how efficiently you can shape it. That's a criteria, let's say, for success.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks for that. And what name have you got today? Regan Tulum?
Oh, sorry about that. Let me change that. David, let's see. I will change that.
No problem. As long as you spoke in your name for the transcript, that's fine, David.
Yep, David Benjamin, and Regen Tulum is what that was. It's a project that I have here in Tulum. Yeah, thanks. Really interesting. Freud, I'd love to get the recording because I missed the first few minutes, but Fabien, you're bringing up some things for me that I've been thinking about for a long time. I'm very resonant with the notion that I should be able to really access my digital notes easily and be able to collate them and put them in groups and put them in lists and really accelerate my ability to make sense out of them. And one of the things I wanted to mention around that is I've been really thinking of kind of a social book where it's even more than just my notes, it's everybody's notes. And I guess it's like the computational text that you just talked about, Freud, where I can see what other people have also said in the book. And this could be a physical book using augmented reality, or it could be a virtual reality book as well. The one other concept around that I think is super important, and it's the concept that I've been using in my web-based work as well, is the notion of a bridge. So to be able to connect a passage in a book to another passage in another book and give it a relationship. So it could be a contradictory bridge from an image in one book to a piece of text in another. And just imagining, especially if the relationships were verified and I was able to see all those connections that anyone else had put together, that it actually becomes another way of thinking about a library. I mean, much better than the Dewey Decimal System in terms of finding things, and also really finding things like you were saying, the things that you didn't expect to find, because you're reading a book and you're interested in a particular paragraph, and then you decide to drill down on it, and it shows everything that anyone else thought was directly connected to that in any other book, PDF, etc. So that's interesting to me. And then back about 4 or 5 years ago, I had done a presentation about the future of books, and my premise was that the book in the future becomes a guided and curated pathway through the relevant universe of multimedia interactions and experiences that are really part of the narrative that the book wants to do. And the last thing I'll talk about is I've been really thinking about how we can reimagine the web from something that's flat and static to a multi-layered. And so the notion of a library layer on top of the web is really interesting to me, and especially if it allows us to connect bridges between pieces of text on a web page to other pieces of text or images or segments of videos and segments of podcasts. You all of a sudden have kind of a way to have that discovery that we were talking about earlier, that you mentioned, where you're not necessarily looking for it, but wow, look at all the other things that are connected to this thing that I'm looking at. So I'm really thinking a lot about that library layer. I'm building a layer anyway, but it could certainly be a library layer. And I'm going to put an article that I wrote about Twitter and how the digital town square actually needs a digital town library. So anyway, I'm really, really intrigued by your work. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to put also a link on the chat. First, everything I've done is on the web. including the wiki. So my website with all the notes is publicly available. Not all my notes, like for example, sometimes I write my dreams when I wake up in the morning, so that's not public, but pretty much everything else is. And that includes a bunch of links, not just within it, but to a bunch of other platforms. And what I put also in the chat is an issue in the repository on the federated aspect, because I'll be honest, I'm excited if some of you wants to play with this, if some of you want to contribute to the code or write some modifiers on how to organize space, but I don't want to host it for you, not because I don't care, but because I think if it's your work, your data, you should properly own it. But it doesn't mean I want you to do it in your corner, and each of us to do it in our corner. So for the bridging and social aspect, beyond, let's say, just content, I find the federation aspect. So like we see at the moment with Mastodon or PeerTube, but there are quite a few solutions using ActivityPub on how you do an action, and you can broadcast it to your network of friends, or everybody who is interested. I started to work on this recently. It does work up to some aspect, but then the question becomes, let's say, what do you actually share? So right now you can share code snippets, so that, I don't know, let's imagine that Andrea starts to tinker with a modifier on how to shape something that is not the background anymore because it's interesting enough to be useful, and to put the code next to books or anything we can start to imagine, which is the interesting aspect. Then can I just literally grab it and put it on my shortcut, which is my virtual wristband in VR, and then use it? So how can we exchange that part, which is the code to manipulate the content? But also, can we exchange viewpoints? So for example, if at some point she wants to show me, oh, this is the part that is interesting because I applied that modifier and I organized my bookshelf like this. Do I get a screenshot out of it? Is it a 2D screenshot, like literally the perspective? Or is it a 3D screenshot so that I can actually peek inside that space? And just like part of that space, is it dynamic? Like, is it literally her view live? Or is it something recorded a couple of days or months ago? So that issue on Git there is specifically trying to address that point, because obviously most of the interesting thing I do, I get through discussions like this. It's not me in my corner. That's the social aspect of it. So yeah, that's when it becomes interesting.
I think this is really interesting work. It's it begs. What can I ask? What engine you're using?
Yeah, it's a 3GS, and on top of this A-frame, I try to stay as high level as possible, because I wish I give a workshop to kids in challenging school next week, and I want them to play with this, to play with 3D objects, but also say, oh, your thing is shit. I don't like it. I want to do better. I'm like, yeah, please do it.
Of course. A couple things that go into this is that on one hand, I mean, I won't go back so much to the architectural matter, but it gets really interesting when you get into the notion of space that is just solid affordance, and in other words, there isn't anything that isn't tied to an affordance, which brings me over to old hyperbrowser metaphors like Steve Holtzman's perspective view, and Danny Brown's Doodlebox, and Roy Stringer's Navihedron. And I mean, they don't necessarily apply to this, but I think maybe perspective view does a bit. I work with a multimedia program called Touch Designer, and I think one thing that's really interesting about it is that you create patches for the manipulation of media fractally, and so you go down into one patch, opens up, there's a bunch of patches within patches within patches. On one hand, it's very elegant, but also it takes a little while to learn. The thing that I think about is that let's see here. I think about affordance, gesture, things like was it John Underkoffler's interface for that he designed for Minority Report, and where all these gestures and all these things basically deal with all these different parameters and how rich a experience that can be, and pretty quickly accessible. So I mean, things like going and touching the book and pressing into it to maybe open it up and have the have the component parts of it, and then maybe swipe over to a connection. I think this notion of gesture within these spaces is affordance and gesture is really interesting, because that was the revolution that came from the iPhone. And this notion of virtual libraries and such as being somewhere between the metaphor of the libraries that exist and a completely new form, I think is really interesting. And then how accessible is it?
So one way I like, so I'm as parsimonious with gestures as I can, because I worry a little bit that it can become tricky to learn, and I'm a terrible dancer. So I can move in space, but if there are too many steps, I'm going to step on someone else's toes. So that's not ideal. It's maybe also the excuse for the parametric aspects, like how can we in the end combine both? Because I think if it becomes powerful when it becomes a grammar, so that you can combine, let's say, one gesture with another rather than just a list, an extremely long list of gestures. But I don't have an answer to this. That's, to me, it's very much at the exploratory aspects. I'm not sure how to do this yet.
Yeah, I think I think a lot of our smart devices, really, except for swipe, tap, in other words, just maybe about a scant handful of gestures. I think that they've really brought forth a really rich set of affordances. I think as was spoken of earlier, the idea is that with Froda talking about the reader is the idea that having an elegant interface experience is just it's really difficult, because finding the most elegant, simple, sensible thing is not always the most obvious.
One of the thing I've partly done, but it just was exploratory, is so you have the keyboard, you start to type in VR, and I did a warm-up exercise. So you type a sentence like, I don't know, I should eat more vegetables, and then you do it measure how long it takes for you, let's say 10 seconds, because it's kind of awkward. You don't really see your keyboard, and you can also do it by pinching at individual letters. And then you do it a second time, 10th time, and every time you compete with yourself, like how quickly do you do it? So basically the goal there is to say, when you have a type of interaction, you need to become efficient with the environment so that it becomes natural. And one way is just like little challenges here and there. So I think that could be a way where instead of just seeing instruction on the side, you have a couple of games or challenges or exercise initially at the very beginning of each session, but then gradually less and less when you have, let's say, a certain threshold of efficiency you find is sufficient for you. So that's, let's say, an easy way to try to do that. And sorry, a quick thing also two things that I think that I did not show properly and that are interesting is, even with simple, like the most basic of pinching with an object and grabbing it, one thing that I did not show, but it's you have your the object and the container. So if you put your thing in a container, and that container can be transparent, you already move things in space and you can interact with it, including one of them was you text and you put it on your wristwatch, the virtual one, and then that becomes the shortcut. So just pinching and dropping on predefined, understandable area, you can really already go a long way. And yes, making it visual. So that you should always have visual feedback, which is not something I've shown today. Like when you do this, or when you do 2-pinch and you have a distance, it should show that distance, or when you select a thing, it should make it transparent, because that helps to gain confidence in the gesture you're learning, or but yeah, that wasn't shown.
I really like this. Obviously, it's something that we've been talking about for a while. One of the things that came through to me looking at it this time is like you already mentioned that it's on the web, it's made with web technologies, but I think that it's important to recognize how intrinsically webby it is as an approach to these things. Not only is it made out of those technologies, but it's born of the sensibility of the web, in that it has that it's not an application in the sense of being applied to a single thing, but sort of the creation of a latent space for a range of applications and functions. And I every time I consider not using the web for frankly anything, I find the idea that an app would then have to then be one thing so contemptible that it always leads me back to the web. So I'm really excited by such a webby approach to being able to do a range of things inside a single space, having a scratch pad or an environment that if you were to characterize what it was for, I mean, in practice, you know, your desk in real life is has a whole bunch of things on it for the most part that are for a little bit is for this, a little bit is for that, a little bit is for that. And I feel like that's a crucial messiness and intermediary state that's going to be really valuable for us to capture. And I think that the web is the absolute least worst place to do that. So I like that I could see myself sort of having lots of things on the go in a single space that they can sort of borrow from each other in terms of how we use it. So that part is something that's especially exciting for me today.
I can highlight a couple of more things, but it's probably more webby than most people think, because okay, you see the display in the browser when I load the VR headset, so then you can see it's webby, but all the comments, so the things I pinch, they are stored on the wiki. There's not, some of them are stored on the page because I want it faster for me to check, but most of them are stored on the wiki. So it means you can access this with a normal 2D browser modified. You can share that page with someone else. You can transclude it in another page of the wiki. Some data, I mentioned it during the last meeting, is stored in WebDAV. So you can, let's say, export a GLTF file, and then people can grab it, use it right away in a directory or with subdirectory, which is also web-based. You have URL parameters. So one thing that I have another little notebook concept right now. It's when I go to bed and I don't bring my phone with me, and I take a little nap, because that's where I get some ideas when I'm the border of consciousness and unconsciousness or dreams, I don't know. And one of the things I wrote just earlier today, well, you can't really read it, but it's an action equal WebXR, so that I can add at the end of every single page of my wiki, which is 1,200 pages, that action, and it means every single page would be preloaded on that environment. It could also, each of them, let's say based on the category or groups, would have a certain set of action. And I haven't done it because I was focusing on the presentation, but I'm pretty confident it's going to take me, let's say, a whole hour to do it, not more, because it's web-based, because everything there is connected, because that content is accessible and efficiently. So it would make, I cannot think of it another way, basically.
I wanted to add one more thing. the most fascinating thing to me about the discussions in the group is to just see how all of our different backgrounds give us such drastically different starting points. So I could see that Fabien's background is in coding. So the way he's approaching the issue is by making the coding visible. Freud's email earlier today, he mentions his background is in human-computer interaction and ergonomics, and then he talks about screens and sitting on a chair and reaching from a chair. My background is in architecture, so everything we're talking about is some kind of room, and I'm always moving from one room to another. So whenever you guys talk about headlines and text and how we spatialize this, I almost have a hard time following, because I'm just seeing every article and every word and every page as a space. So it's very interesting what our different starting points are, is fascinating. And then in this context, if we do pull off the demo day in the spring or summer, whenever that is, I do think it's going to be so crucial to come into the room, and everyone has to, I would almost rephrase Freud's call for us to lay out our vision, or where we think the future is, in terms of, first we lay out what our starting point is, like what's the methodology and the background we all bring to the table, and what's our default starting point, and then what the future is. And in this demo day, I'm really looking forward to have something like Fabien's there, which is such a particular approach about making the code visible. And then we've been working on a Borgesian library where we have an infinite 3D lattice of dodecahedrons, which fit into each dodecahedron fits into a 9 by 9 by 9 meter space. And you literally carve your way like a mole through this 3D lattice of dodecahedrons, and each dodecahedron is like 9 by 9 by 9, and it has certain information, so you could upload text or images or whatever. So our approach as architects is completely about space and navigating through space, and nothing else. That's where we start. So having all of these approaches side by side, and then having this discussion is going to be something that I feel like it's so enriching, because the kind of things Fabien is talking about, I would have never in a million years thought of starting there. I have to start with moving through an infinity of dodecahedrons, because that's just kind of what my mind is what's the default for me. So so thank you so much, Fabien, for this, and like everyone, this is really fascinating, because I think ultimately it's about what is our process of getting to where we want to get, because we all know we're not there. So in a way, these discussions for me are weaving through these different backgrounds and starting points and assumptions to perhaps come together.
I think that is extremely important. I'm very, very happy to hear you say that. When I started this journey myself, it was Mac versus PC. I thought Mac was best. One day I realized they're both awful. Many, many years ago, 1990. Once I developed my own personal philosophy while not trying to talk to anyone else, I realized it's not enough to be a fan of Steve Jobs or whoever. It's really important to go back to before what was implemented. And the reason I'm saying that is so much of Doug and Ted and others' work never happened. Of course not. It would always be like that. And that is why I think it is so extremely important that we write down exactly what you said. Where are we coming from? You're coming from an architectural perspective. I want this book to help someone in 5 or 10 years by going back and thinking, people who are not, with due respect, Randall, polluted with the Apple VR headset or AR, whatever it will be. We will, the future generations, we are the last generation ever to grow up without that headset. The Quest Pro, which I'm lucky enough to have now, is such an intermediary object. It's not really there, but the people in the future, they need to look at what we thought about. So to include what you said of how we approach this, I mean, for me, document, nice typography, make it interactive. That's my narrow-minded perspective to start with. To make it really clear, that would be a beautiful addition to the book. Instead of just writing blah, 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 I think so-and-so, into having a few keywords, because we've discussed very often in this community how keywords don't say much, but to actually have a piece for each one of you by your article saying, please note, I come at this from an architecture perspective. To me, there is no such thing as a background. You know, and then Fabien coming, as he said, and then so on. That would be so absolutely amazing. So there's only so many calls I can do to the community saying another sentence, another perspective is another thing, but you said it here, Andrea. And for those who are available in the chat now or who will be watching, please do it. That would be really nice. Yeah, that was just me waffling on about that. Mr. Anderson.
I'll jump just before. Since I give the presentation, I can do that.
Yes, you can. Of course you can.
First of all, if all of you were software engineers working in VO, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't find that interesting. I mean, I also do this. Sometimes I go with quote unquote my people, but it's not as enriching. So that's the point. Even though it's hard to see where we come from. Also, when we say I don't know, when we say space, what space means for each of us is very different. It can be the space between two words. It can be physical space, and can be space on a hard disk. It can be so many ways to interpret it. So that's tricky, but I think that's valuable. And a lot of the things I have in the book, some things about thinking about thoughts, but from a purely artistic perspective. Nothing has to be done. Something about the design process in architecture, because I'm not an architect. Some things just to make me dream, like living in the forest, what it is to live in the forest, but and design from an architect perspective. Things just for beauty, like generative design, how you can make things look pretty for the heck of it. And recently, the drawing thought that Adam recommended, that Mark recommended, on learning, thinking by doing, on how to take the time to put it on a medium. I also I'm still bad dancer and bad artist. I can again draw a potato, but I still find that extremely valuable. And it's through those different interactions, and sometimes honestly even misunderstanding. Sometimes I think I understand what you all are saying and I don't, but I still have something hopefully creative to build out of it. That's what makes it valuable. So yeah, thanks for being here.
Mark.
Okay. Quickly, Fabien, those some interesting looking books you held up there. Are those on your list of references for the meeting?
No, but I will add them.
That's kind. As long as there's enough, something, and then I can go look it up. There's some things that I thought I might take an interest in. I found this really interesting because, especially when I was listening to Andrea's reflection earlier, and realized, what a particularly different perspective I come from. One I struggle to describe because it doesn't fit in our standard structure. I mean, I suppose in some sense I'm a hypertextualist, but as someone said to me the other day, well, you're really a knowledge whisperer, which I thought actually was a slightly grandiose term, but in a sense, actually most of my thing is actually making sense out of other people's information. It's looking for connections, it's building, but it isn't and has never been building ontological structure, stuff you make with software. In fact, I recall in horror every time I'm asked to put things in boxes, and until there is a structure, and that's something that I suppose that defines my point of view. So whilst I'm, for instance, I things like Bob's approach, which I find really interesting, but a lot of time my mind is one stage before that, and I suppose my frustration here is that, and I spent enough time close enough to software to know how hard it is to build stuff, and I'm also sort of gently despairing of just how far we are from tools being of the level where I can do the things I want to do with them. because I don't, everything has got to be constructed. And what I want to be able to do is to have a sufficient structure that I can then tear that structure apart. Because actually what I want to do is to sort of take things and treat it like a jigsaw. I don't care whether it's a room or a wall or a picture or a cloud. I just want to throw the whole lot on the floor and start sorting. Because, as I find myself constantly saying to people, stop making it tidy. You're just making it harder to understand. Because I think we have a natural tendency to prettiness, which is fine at the end. It's great when we want to inform and we want to show a polished product. But in an exploratory phase, the more I live, the more I realize it just gets in the way. And especially if you're trying to spot what isn't there, be it the connections that aren't there or a description or an idea that isn't there. So one of the things which is why, in a sense, that's why I'm very comfortable with the idea of I don't want a background. I don't want co-affordances of a construct because it gets in the way. It's just more mental. It's more mental processing. It's more visual noise. To do the kind of things I like to do, which is not what everyone needs to do, I hasten to add, but explaining my point of view is basically being able to play with all these things, take all the elements at whatever degree of granularity you need for the task at hand, and look at how they fit together. In a sense, taking whatever it is and treating it like a box of Legos, where there are no rules that says you can't attach a blue brick to a red brick. I don't know if that's informed anyone, but anyway, that's broadly where I'm coming from.
I think it has informed the discussion a lot, because it really goes to the point of what Andrea said of where we're coming from, because you said a lot of terms that are correct for you that were very loaded for me. I can't work in a non-pretty environment. If the Macintosh didn't exist, I would not be in computing. I could not function in a Windows. To me, it is so glaringly, it's like someone is screaming in my face. And I'm not joking. It literally is that. I can see it has an aesthetic for a reason, but so that was a really good example of that. And then I have a request for all of you. Fabien, sometimes these discussions are great. Sometimes they become sublime. When you talked about space in reflection of Andrea, that was sublime, because we have a glossary thing in the book because of author and all of that. And we talked about connections a lot because we have these things called hyperlinks. But the notion of trying to figure out what space means, what interactivity means, these are not, fancy discussions over coffee with, people saying rather, right? These are the most important discussions we can have. So the other side of that is, why do I want to make a book? Why do I not just want to put hypertextual stuff on the web? Part of it is that date thing that I talked about. It has to be locked in time. But also, it makes, you have to decide as an artist, and we're all artists here because we're all developing ourselves. That's my definition of an artist, take it or leave it. But if we can all write stuff down, because the act of writing is an act of translation, right? You don't just take a thought and put it on paper. That's why writing is so fucking hard, right? I do like to write. I'm an okay writer, but I find it excruciatingly hard. So that is why I'm asking you, if you want to write a piece for me to put in the glossary with your name attached or not, up to you, or whatever in the book, if you just want to say, I'm a typographer, space is kerning, whatever it might be, to make these basic statements, they're so important because it helps all the other people in the room navigate, not around them, but with them. They become kind of jumping points. So that was just wonderful. And I yield to Brandel.
Can I jump back before?
Before you jump back, Fabien, just before you jump back, I was going to say, I'm sitting here at the Groucho Club upstairs, where some of you now have been. The notion of space for a human is so important. Being situated in Soho, which is where I grew up, and now having seen some of you in this space, to me is really, truly beautiful. I hope over time we can manage to get together in different locations, despite our main topic being knowledge and virtuality. Fabien, over to you.
So I wasn't going to argue about timestamp and interactivity and all, but since you interrupted me after, I'll still do it very briefly. Every single interaction I did during the demo there was timestamped. So meaning when I was pinching somewhere, it was stored in there. So the same way on Git, in wikis, every single action can be timestamped. So in a way, we can also reach a certain state of a document or even of an experience. I'm not saying it's trivial, might not even be worth it, but interactivity and past interactivity doesn't mean being lost.
This is such an important point. Okay. There's a difference between can be and is. Like PDFs can have metadata, they never do, right? Google Docs, do you have these kind of timestamps to actually access them in a useful form? It's just shit, according to the Google people themselves. So I'm absolutely for the environment you're building, but at a certain point, it's good to say, this is where we are. Even if you just put a giant timestamp on everything and call it a version, fine by me. So we're on the same page, but I think it was initially a different emphasis on on the value we put on specific timestamps. Okay, Randall, I will shut up.
No, I didn't say what I wanted to say.
Oh, okay, fine.
But I'll be super quick. It was back to Mark's point about boxes, and I want to go in defense of boxes. I think there is very little things more powerful than a box. It was a little bit the point I was trying to say during the presentation in London about interfaces. When you put a box around something, you make an interface out of it, and if it has little things on top or even a label, or you can compose it with others, so you make it manipulable. And I think what a lot of people don't get about the beauty and the power of programming is because anytime you make an abstraction, anytime you make an API, anytime you make an interface like this, you make a Lego block. And unlike a physical Lego block, you have infinite space within it. You play with that abstraction. It's extremely powerful. And same that was on my little notes after my quite exciting nap today. I was thinking about spatialized knowledge management, how in the end, most of the things we do, it's knowledge management, but in space, physical or not, but also about embodied mirrorology. So mirrorology as the philosophy of organizing things, including abstract things, making categories, abstraction, and all that. And I think, and I hope it's something I mentioned when we started the discussion, like, I don't know, a year ago, a few months ago at least. To me, let's say the Dewey system itself is not necessarily interesting, but challenging it for a better one, or anytime you make progress in mirrorology, even though it's extremely abstract, it sounds, I don't know, sounds completely pointless, but I think there is very few things that are more powerful than this. Again, it's the way you make the boxes and how you play with those boxes, defining those boundaries so that others can work with it. I think there are very little things more powerful than that.
Women, fire, and other dangerous things. Is that what it's saying?
Yes, it's called Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things, What Categories Reveal About the Mind. So I would add, according to George Lakoff, categories are the most dangerous things you could play with because they organize our whole mind.
And you can't avoid them.
Exactly.
Just like you cannot avoid background and foreground, because it's the way apparently our minds work in part.
But it's related to the perceptual and cognitive limits that we have, and the simplifications that we have to have in order to be able to maintain any kind of focus. It sort of relates to people's misunderstanding of the limitedness of things like the default mode network. But
that's what we are challenges. Sorry. Like that's exactly the kind of stuff we should not be taking for granted. It is exactly the most important things, categories, background, foreground, which VR can challenge, not completely eliminate. But that's why I personally love this tool so much. I'm sorry, Brent.
No. I mean, it's why I'm here, and it's why it's all such a pleasure to be involved in a conversation with you. I mean, that's precisely the point of the webbiness, is that the sort of notional backgroundness or foregroundness, the categoricality of those things can all be latent and conditional, on the specific sort of mindset that a person has. They don't need to switch between applications. They don't have to do stuff like that. I wanted to talk about the messiness and that Mark sort of touched on, the necessity to be able to kind of pull everything out and dump it on the floor, and sort of talk about something that I feel. So, Patrick likely mentioned the John Underkoffler and the Minority Report user interface. People involved in XR are often sort of comically sick of talking about it because it sort of elided a couple of different things in terms of the function of the Minority Report interface and generally science fiction sort of interfaces as performance rather than interactions. And one of the things that I hadn't thought about quite as much until Mark's point was the distinction between computer interaction use and XR use as performance versus kind of working, because they're both actually really important. And what Underkoffler is kind of pursuing with his work in Minority Report and Oblong Industries is actually performance. It's people getting up and being able to make grand gestures, where the grandness of the gesture is at least as important as the sort of the notional impact on it. Whereas when you're really working, what's that one? An actor prepares. Oh, Stanislavski, yes. One of the things that is really important when you're working is that it's the instrumentality of what you're doing is vastly more important than the drama of it. Maybe people really like to have, some people have, code editors that have sort of ground shakes and kind of lightning crashes and things like that as they put every keystroke in. But for the most part, people opt not to do that when they're on their own. And it's very much more a performative thing. And so, yeah, I think I really like both. I love drama and performance, but I understand them to be sort of distinct dimensions. And so I would really like to think about whether there are things in your space, Fabien, that can be fine-tuned and tailored toward performance versus individual sort of and personal, potentially even anticlimactic action. And to that end, one of the things that I haven't shown yet here, but I'm really excited about, is that I've built a couple of vehicles in VR recently. One which is where you have a remote control car, and you have your hands as though you're holding a RC vehicle controller, and so you use one thumb like this to control back forward and one thumb like this to control left and right. And it's pretty weird, pretty difficult to get to grips with initially because there's no physical resistance against it. But the results are actually pretty sublime once you learn how to pilot it and get it around. Because it's so unusual. I've not seen anybody really try to use hands and sort of digits, moreover, perhaps, as inputs within XR yet, and so it's been a really transformative experience for me. And likewise, I've also got an airplane, and you do this with it. So to bank, you do that. You don't go all the way around because you don't actually have the ability to turn your hand in enough degrees of freedom to be able to get all the way around. So it's just relative. So to hold on the level, no matter what inclination or attitude you have, you do that, and then to bank, you do that, and the intensity of your banking is characterized by the degree of your pitch of your roll, and the same with your pitch. And it's, like I said, electric, phenomenal, transformative, and something that I think is going to be really interesting. You mentioned, Fabien, that you believe that you're not a good dancer. One of the problems with dance is that it doesn't have feedback. You don't have a sense of what it is that you're doing, and the rightness or wrongness and people who are good at dance had sort of, I think, develop that sense. Computing is going to give us the ability to get feedback of a kind that's legible to us immediately, no matter what level of skill we're at. And so, I'm really excited by gesture, and I'll put something together to show you sometime. But keep that door open, because I think that there are some really special things there.
I'm going to a dance recital tomorrow. It's Ivan, the oldest boy, who's staying with us. So I think you may have a nuanced view of what you're saying, but it's a fair point. Indeed. Bob, is your hand up from earlier, or would you like to say something now?
I'll say something.
Okay.
First of all, this discussion has, particularly the recent part, has made has given me some sort of an idea that I would love to have in the software that I work on ordinarily, which is Illustrator. And Illustrator, I can take a bunch of text and or images or text image combinations, and with one command group them, and they then become a unit. And what I've realized I would love to have in Illustrator is a command that then pops those out. That is, pops them out and maybe makes them a little bigger immediately. So that's what I've gotten from, at least from the discussion of the space and background. Something that would help me immediately, because because that what would that do if I could take a bunch of a bit of text and some images and make them bigger in front of you. It grabs your attention and focuses things and enables me to work on that. And otherwise, what I'm doing, if I can't, and I cannot do that now, so what I have to do in Illustrator is try to use color or make these things larger for a time, for a while. But then but I don't want them larger forever, because I want them back in their size. I don't want them to block out everything, but I do want either you to focus on it or me to be able to focus on and work on them. And the only thing I can do these days is I can zoom in, which destroys the rest of the background, without having to back out again, or change their color or their shape or contrast, or a number of those kind of things, which makes them stand out and focus. But that's a whole lot of work to do that. So I just want to say, I appreciate the thing, because this is a new functionality that I think I'd want to have in virtual reality as well. If my murals actually turn up in virtual reality someday.
What do you mean someday? We have one of your murals, at least, incredibly beautifully in virtual reality, and we've actually learned quite a bit by having it there. So that was definitely a good idea.
Quickly, to me, that's a win, in the sense that first, it's an interesting discussion in general, and also when there is like, I didn't think about this problem or the solution of that problem before, and it prompted, even if it's for another medium, even if it's for 2D and Illustrator, that's fine. So that's the objective of a prototype. It's not to convince that something is interesting, but it's a prompt for novel ideas, things that haven't been seen before, explored before, that might be bad, have to be honest, but might make perfect sense. And then moving on, let's say, to the next prototype, and how it might also, of course, make sense in VR is especially exciting, but it doesn't have to be, let's say, stuck in there. So yeah, grateful. Thanks for sharing.
Mm-hmm.
Bob, just on a purely mechanical level, depending on the version of Illustrator, if you double click on a group, you should be able to end up in an isolation mode, which if you have the top menu enabled, you'll be able to see being able to jump back through, and you see the sort of the breadcrumbs of the named groups that you have. I can show you sometime, but yeah,
show me.
it is a really interesting way of exploring things, and I absolutely agree. It should be taken further as a sort of a guiding structure. Illustrator is too big to be structured conceptually at this point, which is kind of a shame because it's a phenomenal environment. Sorry.
Yeah,
and I think you could do that sort of thing in Story Space back in about 1990. With maps. Just an interesting sort of connected point. I was just going to briefly just circle around because I hearing Fabien's comment just now, when I mentioned boxes, I may have sort of given the wrong shading to it. When I say sort of horror putting things in boxes, it's not, you're absolutely right about the affordances. It's more people, it's more when I hear, I mean, the classic thing at the moment is the only reason we don't agree on stuff is we haven't found a structure that describes our argumentation so beautifully that there can be no misunderstanding. Well, I think our attempts at understanding, text with AI is proving that actually we're probably being over optimistic there. And some things want to be held, well, it's holding the idea with very, very soft hands so you don't break the egg within. Is I guess what I'm alluding to, but I just want to say I absolutely fundamentally agree with your point about the notion of a box as something that has affordances. Yes, absolutely. It's just that I'm beginning to realize also one of the reasons I think I come to this sort of with this very loose notion is I'm wildly dyspraxic, hand, head or foot, can't play ball games. I'm a very slow left-handed writer, and I've had to work in here most of my life to keep up with everybody else. And there's no paper in there are no boxes, you just have to keep spinning all the plates. And I don't mean that in a sort of multitasking sense, but it's just a different way of holding on to things. And I suppose it's that spills out when I say, I like to have things loose and play around, but I just circle back to the point that no, I absolutely fundamentally agree with a really powerful point about, whether we call it a box or something, but object as things for affordances, because that's a massive force multiplier. Thanks.
Can I just say that one of the things that I've used in some of my mess mapping, that's MESS mapping processes with groups, is blobs, fuzzy blobs, to replace boxes in many cases, because groups, individuals in groups are often talking about fuzzy concepts, which do not have neat boundaries, neat definable boundaries ever. And therefore, yet we accept them as ideas. And I struggled for a while to figure out how to put these into something other than boxes. I tried blobs, and I found that people are much more comfortable now when I say people, I mean the people that come to my groups, my mess mapping groups, who are directors of agencies generally, or deputy directors of agencies. They get together in a group of 20, and I say, we're not, and they say, the boxes make me uncomfortable, make me feel engineering and that sort of thing. But your blobs, your fuzzy blobs, enable me to comfortably talk to other people and also record as much detail as we need to. Generally, not only or anything like that, because I'm speaking now in terms of a blob myself.
So quickly here, that's also one of the reasons I leave the code visible there. It's to show that this is work in progress. This is not like a final product. It's not just to show, oh, code is important or beautiful or anything like this. the boundaries are moving, the proposal is shifting, changing. It's not like I don't know what to do. It's not that I haven't tried anything, but it's not trying to say, oh, there is a perfectly shaped box and this is how it is and you can't change it. That's also not that. So I think, yeah, either I like also sometimes people in presentation slides, they have like a template that looks like it's handwritten, or it's like with a pencil or something like this to say you can challenge it. And sometimes, yes, your box has to look like a box because you need to build on this and you can't afford to change its shape anymore. And sometimes, yeah, you're welcoming, let's say, change. So I think it's valuable already to think about the way you're going to present some potentially shifting boundaries.
And somewhere, by the way, back in the notebooks that I keep somewhere 10 or 15 back, is a whole taxonomy of which I call blobology.
So lots of things that are going around. I started this morning writing a letter to the president of ACM saying I want help with visual metaphor ACM digital library, considering the strong support from Vince Cerf and also from Ismail and others. I think it'll be an interesting discussion, because if we get their support, then we can go and get money so they can actually do this, because they're busy, they don't have time to pay people. Why am I bringing this in now? I'm bringing it in because my sales pitch on the notion of visual meta is to make knowledge objects in the form of documents interactable. I think that the most fundamental part of the universe is interaction, not matter or energy or anything, but interaction. Something doesn't exist unless it's been interacted with something else. It has no size or color or anything. So a lot of what we're talking about here really comes down to how we can augment things so the things we're talking about can be possible. You know, in the digital space, nothing has any inherent value at all. You know, it's just literally a bucket of zeros and ones. So especially when we're moving into the virtual environment where we can argue forever whether there's a background or not, and that is an important argument, but it's still an argument depending on the situation. There is never such a thing as a default background. It's always computationally put there. So I'm wondering if there's any further comments on this, on how the dreams that Fabien is showing. He's showing all kinds of interactions with text in this environment, but that text, if it's only there by itself, if it doesn't have the rich interactability, it only goes so far. So yeah, just throwing that out there a little bit, and then I see Andrea probably has quite a different aspect to come back on.
I think I have something related to what you just said. I would propose the key thing that is not interaction is movement. And I'll give you an example. One of the things we're working on right now, we're experimenting with what we call Alice. So Alice is, we call Alice this effect where you shrink down or you become much, much bigger. So basically we have an entire like Victorian villa that we kind of do things with and experiment with. And at some point you go into the kitchen of this Victorian villa, and then there is a slider. And as you pull that slider, you actually shrink to the size of a cat, or you can go even down further and shrink to the size of a mouse. So the moment you're the size of a cat, then we make you walk back out of the kitchen. And obviously the kitchen is full of all sorts of objects that have an intrinsic scale, like tables and chairs. So when you see those things as a cat, then you know, okay, I've shrunk because, you know, the table has a fixed size and the table is big, so I must be small. But then we make you walk back into the center of the villa. And in the center of the villa, we actually do not show you any objects that have a fixed scale. So we show you like marble sculptures and architectural elements that could be any scale. And the most amazing, mind-blowing thing happened, and we were kind of banking on it, but we were completely shocked at how efficient it was. You basically go from experiencing this Victorian villa as a human, as kind of like a house, like a large house kind of experience of architecture. And you go back into that as a mouse, and all of a sudden is like St. Peter's. All of a sudden you feel like you are in another space. Like it is not the same kind of space. It went from a domestic space to St. Peter's Cathedral. So that is a fundamental shift in everything, in who you are, what you are, where you are, without us having done any interaction. I guess you can say the interaction was the button, but it was a certain kind of movement. And what activated that was first you moving around as a person, and then you moving around as a mouse. So I would argue for movement. Yeah.
I would strongly agree that movement is an interaction. Absolutely. Yeah. You change yourself in relation to the information, and you change the information in relation to you. A really great example of that is, of course, Bob's mural, because on one level, it's just, quote unquote, an information flat thing in space. But what we found that was so incredibly fascinating was that if you use your feet to walk to it, you need a big room. If you use a joystick, you get a bit queasy, but if you pinch grab it and move it around, you move it instantly. So what it becomes in terms of space, because visually it's a huge wall, but when you do this, it becomes something else. But your point about movement, absolutely, completely agree. And when you're talking about these scales, this morning Edgar and I were talking about dinosaurs, because obviously he's 5.5 and he loves dinosaurs. And I have problems remembering millions of year time scales too. And then I just realized, hang on a second, if we're talking about having our demo day in May, let's say, we don't talk about how many days in the future it is, we talk about months, right? We're talking about one level of granularity. If I'm going to see you guys for coffee in a few minutes, I talk minutes, I don't talk seconds. So we have already built in certain chunking. So when I talk about dinosaurs and other long things with Edgar now, I try to remember 66 million years ago was the Yucatan asteroid. And dinosaurs started evolving about 204. So I'm just thinking about these numbers. 66 is not that hard to remember. But for me before, because I wanted to relate it to other schemes, just made no sense. So what you're doing by having the mouse view, the cat view, and the human view, you're setting an easily perceptual understanding of what the different scales are, which is really, really important and useful. Because one of the issues we have with the book and the library, we talk about interactions within the book, and then we talk about interactions within the library and the wider world. And there were some comments way up here, I think it was Adam who said, hang on, where is he? Do we need a transitional space between VR library sections and collections and so on? In other words, without just having a literal rectangle of a book, and books on a shelf, and instead of just having text all floating in a space, how can we, Andrea, with your thinking and your perspective, manage the levels of scale between paragraph level, book level, and library level? It sounds like a related problem.
They should be spaces. So let me
I love your head when you said that. They should be spaces. Yes, architect, please continue.
I agree with what you're saying, that movement is interaction. However, we're dealing right now with a cultural context that is using the word interaction in the context of websites and apps and screen-based applications. And when they are using interactions, they are not thinking about movement the way we've just discussed it. And that is what VR brings to the table. So somehow we have to shift that cultural context. That's why for me, continuing to use interaction is going to fall on deaf ears, or is going to fail to bring to these people's attention, or to everyone's attention, that actually the key thing is the movement component that includes so many other things than pushing buttons, which is how we've been talking about interaction in this context so far. Okay, so that's on that topic. And then something that relates to your question and to the earlier discussions, because I've been trained to think in terms of space, that has brought about many interesting consequences for me. which is I absolutely do not acknowledge any kind of background. Of course, in terms of Gestalt theory, yes, like you need to understand what the object is with respect to everything else in terms of contrast. Otherwise, that object will not form as an individual object in your perception. So that whole Gestalt psychology thing and perception, that's, of course, I'm not denying that. But for me, everything is in space. There is nothing, there's space that's closer to you and further away from you, but there's not something here and then a background, because space is just everywhere. And now here it comes, the point is that I think of everything else, including knowledge, within this paradigm. I think that knowledge is in a way boundless, and there is no you sitting with your text in a neutral place, because you're always sitting within a space of some kind of knowledge. So for me, because I'm an architect, the spatial paradigm encapsulates everything as a container of thought. So yeah, I don't understand any backgrounds. I don't understand anyone sitting with some text in anything that's neutral, right? You're always in a space. You're just producing more space, or you're defining more space. And then the problem of categories in this paradigm of thinking of knowledge as space becomes one of, where do you draw the line? And of course, it's arbitrary. You know, since everything is space, we're just talking about where we draw the line, which is the process of categories and what is it that we want to box in. And my last thought is that actually my presentation, the dialogue between Borges and Vygotsky that I did in London, I know that was a horribly convoluted text, but that was actually Borges and Vygotsky fighting about what is a box in virtual reality and deconstructing that. So I'm really happy to have this conversation again in a way and have time to actually tease through all of these perspectives, because the thesis of my presentation in London was that the most important thing we should be talking and arguing about when it comes to virtual reality and text is the process of categorization.
It's definitely key, yes. We have 4 minutes left. Should we go 15 minutes over for once? Who can make 15 more minutes?
I can.
Okay, it would just be a crime against humanity to stop right now. Fabien.
I don't think space is enough. Actually, it's funny that you give example, Andrea, about scale. And it's, of course, it's something mind-blowing that people who are not used to VR, they go in a VR space like, wow, I'm somewhere else. And then, oh, I can also change the size of everything. But honestly, I don't think that's enough. I like to think of it as a causality bubbles. So basically, every time you enter a space, it can have a certain scale, yes, but everything you do, every interaction you do can have a different consequence. It doesn't have, you can have, of course, a traditional physics model, like the gravity here, I drop my pen, it's what I have roughly on Earth. I mean, I have exactly on Earth, but if I do it in VR as a simulation, I will have an approximation of the physical model I have here, but it doesn't have to be. And it means every time we go in a space, even when we encapsulate a space in another in VR, it doesn't have to have the traditional physical causal model at that scale, and it doesn't have to respect physics. So I think scale is definitely interesting, but I think what it shows is, for example, the interesting interaction between chemistry or between particle in chemistry or human at our scale are not the same. And the ability to explore this is pretty fascinating, but it's something that it's not just scale. It's the different causal model and the one that don't even exist that we can explore.
Bob.
I was just wondering, as a result of Andrea's comment, whether we're in trying to communicate with each other, we're trying to whether she was, were you saying, Andrea, that our Gestalt perception processes suddenly stop when you're in the different spaces that you're making? Or
No.
are they simply manipulating the foreground backgroundness of that we always have?
I think those processes are the same. I wasn't implying that we're changing them in any way. I was just implying that they do not, for me, become categories that can influence thought, that the leading paradigm that I use personally to understand knowledge or anything, to model these things in my head, is not that of background and foreground and objects taking shape with respect to a background, is that of space. Whereas maybe some of what you're describing and other people is hinting at a paradigm of understanding the space of knowledge in terms of something that's in the foreground and it's seen against the background that is something or nothing or neutral and so on. So I'm just talking about two abstract paradigms of understanding the space of knowledge. So space as in this kind of space being one of them, and the other one being more like the Gestalt model of how we read objects with respect to a background. So I'm thinking of them as kind of in a metaphorical kind of way.
Andrea, I'm an architect by training also, though I've never practiced. And I wonder if your comments about background relative to space would change if instead you substituted the word context. Because you could argue, or I would suggest, that context is a kind of multidimensional background, some of which you can't see and some of which you can. In terms of your mouse example or cat example, the cat has a different context than I might have, but the context travels with the cat, even though the background might have changed.
The context travels with the cat.
Oh, thank you for that. I need to think about it. I think, yes, something changes. Absolutely. I can feel things shift in my head, but I need to think about it for longer. But thank you for that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I feel like we should have this whole conversation again with this perspective in mind. Like, what is context? Absolutely. Thank you.
I have to jump in there because that was just too beautiful, James, what you said about context travel with the cat. I mean, what is a movie? A movie, I would say, is almost entirely context switching. Or reading a novel, you're trying to be in someone else's head to experience whatever's happening, because the thing that is happening is usually straightforward. You know, you read a synopsis about a movie, you don't feel it. You know, why are you going through the movie? It is for context, right? I just thought that was nice. They would call it background in the media industry. Context fits perfectly there in addition. So strange to see outside of a Tuesday, Jim. And thank you, Americans, for being here on Black Friday and everything.
Well, that assumes that we're all consumerists, which we almost all are. I think, Jim, you have the quote of the day. With the context travels with the cat. It's just
and mouse.
It's just too beautiful. And in one sense, and I want to say that one of the things that the information murals that I make is an attempt to alter context in a certain way. The one that I've shown most often in this group is one that has the context of 1,000,000 years. I want to remind you all. Now, how do we show that in space? Well, I had that discussion with the managing director of the British agency, who, when I had my mural only go out 40,000, a mere 40,000 years, it only went out. And he says, no, it's wrong. And I thought, oh, it's wrong. And he says, it's, the high level waste doesn't get back to background level for a million years. And then I said, I answered in a spatial way, but you don't have enough hallway space in your agency for me to show a million years on this mural. You'd have to walk, all the way from, probably all the way to Oxford from where we are in order for me to show that. So, we're manipulating these kind of space, Andrea, this is really an interesting conversation because we're manipulating the cat. You're manipulating the cat and the context as well. And so am I in a certain way in the murals.
Well, and in that mural, what you did was essentially telescoped time.
Yes.
In terms of at varying rates.
And all the contact, everything that was in the time, a million years of geological change. Think about that, as well as climate change, a million years of it.
Yeah, no, that's really super amazing, that kind of timescale. I would recommend all of you to watch the BBC series Ghosts. It's there's also an American version now, which is not so bad. There is a reason for it. The premise is this young couple inherits a house. She gets in a coma, dies for a few seconds, she's back again, and then boom, she can see the ghosts that are still in the house. But the reason I bring it up right now is these people have died in different periods of time. So there's a Stone Age guy, there's a military guy, etc. And the way that they play with the context of their different time periods can sometimes be really clever and sometimes quite awkward and stupid. Just saying, there are many different ways where we can bring about the context and that kind of a space, including in something. But it's such a nice program. Go watch it. We're running out of time.
I think I've got a very quick one. Just quickly on the context. I mean, that very much chimes to me. Context is as much sort of gestalt as I need in the moment. So in other words, yes, things have a relationship to things around them, but in the way that I tend to work, they don't have to be fixed. It's a bit like a fog of war in a game, a computer game or something. You see as far as you need to. You may not need to see anything at all. Sometimes you may need to see a lot to understand. In other words, to better understand the thing in your immediate focus. But the reason was to just circle back to Fro's question about visual meta. I think it's an important thing to raise is that one thing that's come through very clearly from me of a year of sort of just talking to colleagues about visual meta is that I think what most people don't understand is actually about metadata. The reason being that metadata is something that's done by the man in the brown coat behind the curtain. Metadata is, we want lots of that, we want to be accurate, but thankfully I don't have to do that. And I think
actual brown coat.
Yes, I was, but sort of brown coat, I mean. It's sort of janitorial role. And having been an information plumber for a good period of my life, I do understand, that's actually how people see it. But I think it's terribly important because if it's something just done by somebody else, which is where I think a lot of people's mindset is stuck, we won't move as fast as we want to have the rich metadata that earlier in this conversation we've said we need to get the sort of things we want to do in VR. And I don't claim to have an understanding how we move the needle on that, but I do think we need to perhaps get people to start thinking about metadata isn't what you put into your cool code. That more the point, your cool code is stuff all use unless there is good metadata to put into it. Done.
So I never managed to get my hand in the right spot. So many things there, Mark. First of all, I had a meeting with some people today in a completely different industry here at the Groucho and tried to explain a little bit about the work. And I said, metadata is basically data that says what data is. So in a document, you may very well have the title, but if it can't be understood by a computer, it's the title, that's all it is. But you said something even more interesting. When you talked about you only see as far as you need to, that is essentially so crucial to the kind of gamuts we're talking about, and that is gamuts. Now, one of my very first heroes in this industry is Bruce Horn, because he was the one who wrote the Macintosh Finder, and he was the first to take me seriously, so I owe him personal and emotional gratitude to some serious degrees. After he did the Finder, many years later, for his own delectation, he did a new version, which he called Context, which of course really fits in this. And also he did something quite brilliant. And I had stolen this idea. Well, I hadn't stolen, I had it in parallel in a different area. So he thought I stole it, which caused a bit of friction until I explained where it came from. It's called sticky paths. And his implementation is if you scroll in the Finder, and when you get to a folder, the folder will stay. You can keep scrolling. So you will have on top a continuous list of how deep you are. So we call that, again, sticky paths. And when I had something similar in my system, not with folders, something else, I got really annoyed and had to explain that in a fighter aircraft, the radar, if it sees something, but it's out of range, because you can zoom, change the range of what you're seeing, it'll stick it to the top of the screen. So if there is an enemy threat, you don't want that just to be gone. So it's stuck at the top. The pilot knows that this is not within this scale, but it's somewhere there. So that is, I think those two things are incredibly powerful ways of, this is where you're working, but there's other stuff that's important. You can call it background if you like, Andrea.
Is the word you're using TOPS, T-O-P-S, sticky tops?
No, thanks for asking, Bob. P-A-T-H-S, path. Sticky paths, yeah.
Paths, all right.
So it's like a dynamic breadcrumb trail, in a sense. Yeah.
Very good. I'd love to have that.
Now that Bruce and Brandel are in the same company again, I hope one day to have one of these meetings with Bruce. So many perspectives.
Oh yeah, I'll have to show him the sticky paths that are in that what a prototype because I implemented that. The other thing about the breadcrumbs aspect of it is that it's sort of implicitly constructed in the way that breadcrumb trails require at some level intentional gestures to compose. So yeah, there are some really interesting consequences for being able to build that structure around the incidental activity that people have.
Oh my God, Brandel, you're really annoying because that's such an interesting topic. Because our book is so gosh darn big, some of you have been involved in conversations in the community how to make the book smaller for specific purposes. In other words, how to produce your own specific bindings. And we've looked at ways of, you select and highlight text throughout the book as you read it, then get to a point where you're saying, make a new PDF, but only with the pages that I've highlighted. So you can share that. Another one we've looked at is make a new PDF based on this single article, because I can see that. But also been looking at bookmarks. But then I can't really understand the point of a bookmark when you can highlight text and you can see that in an outline. But they still become really important issues for how you choose to purposefully say this bit is interesting for some reason. And then, of course, in the future, how you access that. It also becomes a bit of this kind of scale and gamut issue, how far you want to look. But since we're running out of time, and both in terms of today and in terms of the year, I'm not sure if we should have a full meeting in December, because how am I going to get it transcribed, right? Because this needs to go in the book. But I'm wondering if soon you want to have a second part of this conversation, either an open conversation or someone else does an initial presentation like Fabien did, or what you would like to do. The aspects we've come into today, I think really needs and deserves a follow-up. And I see there's some kind of glitter coming from Sweden.
Very interesting, quick interjection that it comes to mind now that the original purpose or the original invention of breadcrumb trails was to remind you if you'd visited this place before. So it was an early hypertext thing. So, oh right, I came here, but by a different path. And incidentally, you left breadcrumbs sort of on the way, which created the trail. But the starting idea has been lost to time, and what we're left with is breadcrumb trails, which are still useful for a different purpose.
This whole question of context, of context being carried along with the cat, and with the architectural spaces and those in our own mind is really an interesting topic. This has been a wonderful discussion, and there may be some other ways getting into it again. I'm not sure what they might be, but you know, that's certainly possible.
I want to
let me add a single word in addition to context, but it's something that in my mind relates to context, even though it's the opposite practically, and that is the word catalyst.
Say that again, please.
The word catalyst.
Catalyst. Okay, thank you.
Catalyst. I think of ideas as short word or text phrases. And in that sense, those short phrases trigger a whole world of ideas within my context of knowledge. So that's where the catalyst that triggers, one's positioning in the context of knowledge. That's why, in my mind, they're related. So I think it's a worthwhile part of the context discussion to keep catalysts in mind.
I think of spark points, but I think catalyst is really nice. But yeah. Yes, please.
I want to add something quickly. I'm sorry to drag this on to what Mark said about bookmarks. So back to my inability to think of things in anything but space. For me, something like the big PDF is a city. And if I like certain parts of the city, or I like the city has different itineraries and different way to cross the city. And all I need to switch my experience of the city are good shortcuts. I don't think of cutting the city in a different way and reconfiguring it. I could, but especially in the virtual space, I could cut up the city and reconfiguring it in a sense in which you are talking about allowing people to read PDF certain parts. But as long as it's very quick for me to have shortcuts, that's all I need. So the efficiency of the shortcuts actually eliminates the need to reconfigure the city. So every day with good shortcuts, I could have a completely different experience of the same city.
I think that's a very interesting thing to say. And obviously you're talking in a much, much richer sense, but I just wanted to show you, as you're reading in the book as it is now, you select text to Command F. It doesn't do a normal find. It takes the occurrences of the text, shows it with headings, because those are like the districts of the city for context and so on. The sentence in black, the word in bold, so you can quickly have a look at who else talks about these things and jump around if you want to. I mean, how many people talk about Nokia, right? Only 2 people. But this is the reason we have the timeline. It's a hidden context. Now you can see, I mean, I didn't search for that. I'm just showing an example, but bam, it was a shortcut for the knowledge of more of that subject, etc. So these are very, very rudimentary things, but it's fun to mix rudimentary and far out. Okay, so everyone, we do have these meetings every Monday and Friday, as you know. Oh, yeah, human bookmark. Okay, maybe no drinks for you tonight, Fabien. Feel free to join any Monday and Friday. We're generally here. There's been maybe twice this year, there's been either just nobody or just one other person, but every other time it's been quite incredible, actually. There's been someone, and the quality of the discussion varies greatly, as it should, I guess. And I'm extremely grateful today for the new contexts that we were made all aware of. And I wish you the best weekend. And I'll see those of you who have time on Monday, and we will continue. Please consider writing the tiny bit of, if you've been on a headset, and this includes you, Bob, because you've been there. Was there an experience that surprised you a bit? And is there something you wish just on that single basic topic? Plus, if you want to do Andreas, this is where I'm coming from. That would be amazing. I'll put that in your glossaries. All right. Have a good weekend, everyone. Thanks.
Everyone,
take care. Bye.